Hello everyone, welcome back to APCS in under 2 minutes. Today I'll be covering Unit 8 of APCS 2D arrays. 2D arrays are an array of arrays, where in a one-dimensional array, each element corresponds to something like an integer or an object. In 2D arrays, each element corresponds to an array itself. Now, they're very useful for storing the data for a seating chart or just anything in a grid-like structure like a chessboard, for example. Now, to declare in a 2D array, you would start with the data type and then two pairs of square brackets, opening and closing square brackets, then the name of your array, and then what you want to do is you type new and then int and then pairs of square brackets again, and in the first one you want to write the number of rows you want to have, so for example 3, and then for the second square bracket you want to have the number of columns you would have, for example 4. That would create a grid or a 2D array with 3 rows and 4 columns. Now to get the length of a grid, or the number of rows I mean, you can use grid.length. And since grids are in APCS are uniform, meaning each row will have the same number of columns, you can get the number of columns using grid at 0.length. Now, to iterate through a 2D array, you cannot use a single for loop because you have rows and columns. So instead, you'd have to use a nested for loop like this. So first we have an outer loop to loop through the rows and an inner loop to loop through the columns. And as you can tell, grid.length, this returns the number of rows. Grid at r.length, which is just a variation of grid at 0.length, which will return the number of columns in the 2D array. Now you can also use a for each loop, which I taught in the previous arrays and array list videos instead of this. So you would type for int row in, let's just grid, and then a second for loop for int num in row. And this is how you would use a for each loop to iterate through a 2D array. Thanks for watching.